Transcrico total characters equals 42,000. Limit maximum Rotero characters equals 42,000. Rotero alvo characters equals 42,000. The fluorescent lights in the parking garage hummed like an absent witness. Franklin Hayes stood with his hand on the hood of his rental, palms flat against metal that still smelled faintly of engine oil and the ghost of hot coffee. He had been awake 14 hours. The night had folded into his shoulders like a coat. A badge hung at his hip under an untucked shirt, an agency emblem he never displayed in small-talk circumstances. Tonight, he carried it the way a man carries a quiet truth, against his body, obvious if you knew to look. He heard the boots before he saw the officer, steps that struck the concrete with a practiced impatience. A flashlight cut through the low light and found the badge at his hip. Franklin's breath made a soft fog in the cold air. His hands rose slowly, visible on the hood, fingers splayed, not in surrender, but in the posture of someone who knows the choreography of encounter and refuses to improvise panic. He kept his voice low, methodical. "Good evening," he said. "Name's Hayes, Federal." Before he finished, the man in uniform stepped in, hand already moving toward a holster as if to claim authority by touch. "Hands on the hood, now," the officer barked. The command came clipped, a performance of control. A flashlight glare split Franklin's collarbone. The badge at his hip caught the beam and flashed, a small, sudden star, then stayed quiet, metal and enamel like a truth that will not burn out. Stay with this story to the end. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss what unfolds. The command looped in the hollow. Franklin kept his hands where the officer could see them and began to speak again, this time even quieter, every word measured. "Sir, I have identification," he said. He felt the old, clean friction of protocol. Name, agency, reason. A civilian complaint had arrived at his desk earlier that week about a stolen vehicle in the neighborhood. He had driven the longer route through the federal parking to pick up paperwork and a cup of coffee. He had not expected the parking level sweep. The officer's shadow cut like a verdict over his shoulder. The officer's hand hovered at his holster. "Move, now," he said. Suspicion had a shape in that voice. It wore itself like a shield and threw a question at Franklin's chest that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with who gets believed when evidence is thin. Another cruiser idled at the garage entrance, its blue lights painting the concrete in a cold rhythm. The echo of the building made the small drama feel larger, like a stage set for something going wrong. Franklin produced his credentials with a practiced motion, the badge on a lanyard sliding out of his jacket, catching the light again. "Franklin Hayes, Special Agent." He held it up for the officer to see, palm open, wrist steady. The officer squinted, fingers tightening on a radio clipped to his shoulder. A second uniform moved closer, face blank with the kind of caution trained into men who must always show they will not be surprised. "Alleged stolen vehicle?" the officer asked, repeating a suspicion he had heard through dispatch, the rumor that becomes permission. He did not pause for Franklin's answer. The word "alleged" would assuage him only as far as procedure allowed. Franklin answered as he would in any interview room. The theft complaint had been made by a resident 2 blocks over. Description of a vehicle matching his rental's make and color. He had been in and out of the building on foot in the hour before. He gave the facts plainly, each sentence a small, deliberate arrangement of evidence against speculation. He kept his hands flat. He kept the badge visible. The officer moved closer until his knees touched the metal of the hood. Close enough that the officer could see the pores on Franklin's knuckles. Close enough that the smell of his cologne, pepper and something sharp, made a small line in the air. The officer's jaw twitched. "Step away from the vehicle," he said again, voice low now. "Hands behind your back." Franklin did not step. He had spent years teaching men and women how to handle pressure. Tonight, pressure came not from a court, but from an instinctive, territorial policing of space, who belonged where. He kept his hands visible and said, "If you need to identify me, take a look at the credential and call it in. I'm cooperating." One of the officers, Patterson, later identified by badge number in the complaint, kept his body camera pointed, the red LED blinking like a heartbeat. Franklin could see it, the small lens catching reflections of fluorescent tubes, of their faces. The light made everything literal. Cameras, he thought, drew the map of truth in a way words could be persuaded away from. Timestamps, frames, angles. He wanted that camera to keep recording. He did not know then, but small decisions about who recorded and who could end a recording were the hinges the rest of the narrative would swing on. The lead officer, Bradley Cooper, broad-shouldered, jaw set like a hammer, leaned over until the flashlight painted Franklin's eyes. "I said get down on the ground," Cooper said. The imperative was not a question. Cooper's voice had a habit of turning contingency into mandate. He had been on the force for years and wore that tenure like a second uniform. Franklin watched a micro-expression pass across Cooper's face, an impatience that curved toward contempt, a flash of recognition that suggested Cooper's view of the world and Franklin's did not align. "Sir," Franklin said, quieter now, each word deliberate, "I will not make sudden moves. I am armed only with the authority of my badge, which you have in your flashlight." One of the officers, Patterson, later identified by badge number in the complaint, kept his body camera pointed, the red LED blinking like a heartbeat. Franklin could see it, the small lens catching reflections of fluorescent tubes, of their faces. The light made everything literal. Cameras, he thought, drew the map of truth in a way words could be persuaded away from. Timestamps, frames, angles. He wanted that camera to keep recording. He did not know then, but small decisions about who recorded and who could end a recording were the hinges the rest of the narrative would swing on. The lead officer, Bradley Cooper, broad-shouldered, jaw set like a hammer, leaned over until the flashlight painted Franklin's eyes. "I said get down on the ground," Cooper said. The imperative was not a question. Cooper's voice had a habit of turning contingency into mandate. He had been on the force for years and wore that tenure like a second uniform. Franklin watched a micro-expression pass across Cooper's face, an impatience that curved toward contempt, a flash of recognition that suggested Cooper's view of the world and Franklin's did not align. "Sir," Franklin said, quieter now, each word deliberate, "I will not make sudden moves. I am armed only with the authority of my badge, which you have in your flashlight." He explained that he did not carry a service weapon at that moment, that he had left official gear in his vehicle. This was not a case he wanted to escalate. "If you think a crime is being committed, run your plate and we can resolve it." A note of impatience bowed Cooper's mouth. "We had a report of a stolen car. You're matching the description." He looked, unavoidably, at Franklin's skin, the way a sunbeam finds a detail and refuses to look away. Step back, hands. The motion that changed everything was small and bureaucratic. Cooper, with a swift movement, reached toward Franklin's jacket for the badge, but barely grazed the metal of the credential. The flashlight beam glinted off the badge and sent a shard of light across Cooper's face. For a fraction of a second, Cooper paused. Franklin felt watchful seconds lengthen into a tiny quiet. The color drained from Cooper's cheeks. His expression went almost white. That "went white" was not a metaphor for guilt, as much as it was the physical unraveling of a script when a new fact makes the old script unreadable. "FBI?" Cooper asked, incredulity cutting through the command. The syllable fragmented into the air between them. Voices in the adjacent car park rose in an inaudible murmur. Cooper had expected one category of person, and in one flash his map redrew itself. The badge should have ended the encounter with professional deference. Instead, it intensified the encounter. Who responds to federal presence in a local code enforcement event? Who explains? Who yields the floor? If the body camera kept rolling, the clip would later show Cooper's face as a study in recalibration. It would show Franklin standing steady, voice measured, the badge hanging at his hip like an argument. It would show a second officer attempt to reach for Cooper's shoulder,
an attempt to orient the situation back toward a local script. And, crucially, some nearby cameras would later record the decisive minute when Cooper's hand moved toward his radio and the body camera's red LED went dark, an action that the internal complaint would later describe as intentional deactivation. That detail, whether the camera had been intentionally stopped, would be contested in hours and then days of sworn affidavits, in subpoenas seeking server logs, in the particular syntax of metadata timestamps that do not lie easily. For that initial minute in the garage, the facts were immediate. A badge flashed, a face went white, a camera light stopped blinking. The rest was process. Franklin kept his hands where the officer could see them. He said nothing to inflame. He had trained agents to de-escalate. He had briefed rookie officers in interviews. He knew when to speak and when to catalog. Do what you need. Call your sergeant. My ID is visible. I will stand where you order, but I will not be detained without reason. Cooper's voice tightened. You're coming with us for questioning, he said. The phrase had the weight of capture.
He moved first with legalistic certainty, grabbing Franklin's arm. Another officer, Williams, took the other arm. Franklin felt the pressure in his joints, and the shape of force rearranged the air around his chest. An elbow jabbed against Franklin's ribs. The gesture was not brutal in the way of a grotesque assault. It was an instrument of control. Franklin thought of the complaint that would be written later, of the paragraphs that would have to map sensory detail into formal language. The hum of fluorescence, the metallic clink of a badge, the click when the camera stopped. He noticed every sound, the distant slosh of tires in the garage, the muted echo of voices, and committed them to a memory not for vendetta but to document. He had done this before, in other contexts, witnessing bureaucracies to preserve facts that might later challenge narratives. By the time the officers released him, someone on the periphery had recorded a fragment on a phone. A neighbor, a passerby, an employee at a nearby office, small tech in an ordinary palm, captured 3 seconds that threaded together the critical elements: the flashlight's glare, the badge's flash, Cooper's hand on his radio, the sudden stop of the red LED on the body camera. That 3-second clip would leak. It would not be polished. It would be raw and partial, and that very partialness would be the seed of its power. Franklin filed a formal complaint the next morning. He wrote with the procedural clarity he habitually practiced: times, badge numbers, directives given, the sequence of movements, the names he had been able to gather. He attached his own statement and requested copies of body-worn camera footage, dispatch logs, and any contemporaneous reports. He requested preservation of evidence. That request would, in later documents, be referred to as timely and precise. He knew the importance of timing in a bureaucracy. Requests made loud and early are less easily drowned. The response was not instant absolution. Internal channels moved the way institutions move when a tension touches their skin, slowly and with many hands smoothing. Lieutenant Commander James Wilson, a mid-level DOJ overseer whose office handled federal place interactions, received an initial call from the local department. There would be a record, a terse message, a forwarding conversation, an assurance that "we'll handle it internally." Those words were small levers that could nudge outcomes toward cover or toward admission. Franklin had read that ledger of phrases enough to know which way they tended to flip when left unexamined. At the same time, a reporter named Sarah Bennett began chasing the fragment. She worked at a local investigative desk and had built a reputation for meticulous document work. Sarah called Franklin after she saw the clip, a voice equable and urgent over the line. "I want to confirm facts before I publish, and I want to give you a chance to tell your side." That clip leaves a lot unsaid. He met her in a cafe that smelled of burnt espresso and paper. Sarah unfolded her laptop and showed him what she had: a copy of the 3-second clip, a screenshot of a text exchange between officers that suggested talking points being circulated, and a batch of FOIA requests she had filed for body-worn camera logs. She spoke in a reporter's cadences, patterned, precise, and slightly impatient with bureaucracy. If the body cam was turned off, there should be server logs showing the disconnect, she said. If it was edited, there's going to be a metadata trail. If the department delays, we subpoena. Franklin looked at the clip again, frame by frame, and watched the nuances he had felt with a strange distance. Cooper's jawline, the way a second officer's eyes flicked to the radio, the specific moment the red light went out. Sarah's questions were those of someone trained to unsettle silence. Who else saw this? She asked. Did any cameras in the garage capture audio? Were there any dispatch notes? He told her what he knew. Officers present, the approximate time, 22:14 on the scanner logs he had accessed before he'd left the garage, the make of his rental, the smell on the concrete. He told her about the call he had placed to the internal affairs line within an hour. He told her that he had requested preservation and that he intended to pursue the complaint methodically. He did not say everything. He withheld any phrasing that would make him appear vengeful. He was a man installed in an institutional language of process, and he would use it. Sarah's reporting would find, through subpoenas and FOIA and a reluctant chain of emails, that the body-worn footage for that night had inconsistencies. According to server logs, later described by IT technicians in a sworn affidavit, the body camera assigned to Cooper showed an abrupt cessation of recording at 22:14:11, and a subsequent file uploaded to the department's cloud repository bore a modification timestamp inconsistent with lifecycle norms. The small details of bytes and server clocks mattered. Metadata suggested an interruption and a later re-upload. A redaction log from an internal video editor contained a note, trim requested, with an editor's initials matching a records custodian later named in the complaint. Language in the reporting had to be careful. Sarah wrote that preliminary findings suggested unusual handling of footage, and that internal emails indicate a desire to control narrative. She avoided accusations of criminal intent and instead pointed to practices: delay in responding to preservation notices, inconsistent logs, and a chain of custody that left gaps. Newsrooms moved differently than agencies. Where agencies saw protocol, reporters saw the shape of a story, an instantiation of a pattern that touched more than one life. Sarah's editors approved a cautious publish, a report that framed the clip as an instigating fact and the server logs as corroboration of a behavior pattern needing public oversight. The story ran with Franklin's permission, his complaint and quotes printed alongside the forensic details. Within hours, the 3-second clip, raw and grainy, was already being shared alongside the report. Viewers saw the badge and imagined the stopped heartbeat of a man whose authority should have shielded him but did not. Public reaction was immediate in its focus, not its nuance. People online repeated the image of the badge and the red LED going dark. Commentators framed it in the larger context of profiling and policing that has become a national conversation. In interviews, Maya Brooks, a civil rights attorney Sarah had contacted, spoke with the careful moral urgency that lawyers often marshal. This case appears to show a thread of conduct that demands independent review, she said. When cameras stop, when metadata is inconsistent, we must ask why. Institutional reaction moved through layers. Deputy Chief Harold Stevens issued a statement that the department would cooperate fully, language that buffered without promising action. The union president, Gerald Tucker, framed the officers as professionals under pressure, warning against rush judgments from voices who had not heard all sides. Internally, memos circulated recommending caution, let the discipline process run its course, and offering officers solidarity. Co-workers of Franklin, sensing the stakes, began to divide along expected lines. Those who would stand by their union's defense, and those who whispered about integrity and accountability. The initial public hearing, an internal review convened under the auspices of the department's oversight board, was scheduled 2 weeks later. The calendar placed pressure in the ordinary way. Deadlines force answers, and answers drive records into the open.
Before that hearing, Sarah and Franklin worked a quiet friction. She sought documents and interviews. He coordinated with counsel and checked that evidence preservation orders had been filed. They both understood the interplay between documentation and public conscience. One could not exist effectively without the other. Franklin's daughter, Emma, was 6, and the episode had weight at home in small human ways. She asked questions that pierced the legalese. "Daddy, why did the man stop you?" she asked one evening while coloring. Franklin knelt beside her and chose words that were honest and safe. He told her that sometimes people make mistakes about others, and that grown-ups must use facts and fairness to make things right. He wrapped his arms around her shoulders and kept the details away from the child's small curiosity. This was a protection he did not think of as avoidance, but as care. As discovery moved, witness statements shifted.
Patterson, whose body cam had recorded the early frames, initially told Internal Affairs that the camera stopped working, as if to render the interruption a technical glitch rather than an intentional deactivation. But other officers' statements, taken in later interviews and pieced together by Sarah and Maya, suggested a different chronology. A radio call, a line of text that appeared in a group chat, clean message, and an email trail from a records custodian referencing sensitive material. Each document was a small window. Combined, they formed a larger architecture that suggested coordinated steps to manage perception. Sarah emphasized the documentary chain. Dispatch logs placed the initial call at 2212. Patrol Unit 14A reported arrival at 2213. The body cam file showed cessation at 2214:11. The records custodian's upload log bore a modification timestamp of 0217 the next morning with a note, "Trim requested." Sarah labeled nothing as conclusive and instead placed items side by side like evidence boards in a newsroom: timeline, logs, emails, clip. She wrote that alleged editing and delayed disclosure raised questions requiring independent review. Public appetite for certainty was not necessarily served by cautious phrasing, but the analysis succeeded in pushing oversight bodies to act. The FBI's Richmond field office opened a preliminary inquiry after internal push from Commander Wilson, who had been briefed and who had phoned a superior to request guidance. Wilson's role was procedural, neither prosecutor nor judge, but an overseer ensuring that interagency protocols held. His office forwarded a preservation request and coordinated with the local department about access to raw files. At one point, the local records custodian replied, in language later included in a production log, that certain files were archived in a backup server that requires authorization. The phrase was bureaucratic but functionally delaying. As the story spread, community groups organized a small vigil outside the police precinct. People carried signs that insisted on transparency. The language of protests stayed measured and anchored to the explicit claims: preserve footage, release logs, independent oversight. Flyers circulated that asked neighbors to attend a public hearing and to register concerns with the city council. The public pressure mattered. Institutions, when subject to sustained attention, change habits. That was the core civic insight Sarah's reporting sought to make visible. Public scrutiny can act as a lever for institutional accountability when documentation reveals pattern. In the days before the hearing, Franklin received a late-night envelope at home containing a USB drive, an anonymous drop-off with no return address. He did not open it. He photographed the envelope, informed his counsel, and logged the arrival with the oversight office. Anonymous materials in legal battles can complicate proceedings. They can also be traps. Franklin chose procedure over impulsive use. That restraint would later strengthen his credibility in hearings where opponents tried to paint him as the architect of leaks. The hearing itself began under a low ceiling in a municipal building, fluorescent lights again humming, microphones placed like tiny sentinels across a long table. Citizens filled the back row and watched. Franklin sat flanked by Maya Brooks, his counsel, whose presence steadied him. The local deputy chief and officers were present. A staff attorney from the Oversight Board called the meeting to order and read the agenda. Overview of complaint, witness testimonies, review of body-worn camera logs, and recommendations. Public testimony opened with neighbors describing their sense of safety being compromised by unequal enforcement practices. Then the matter turned to the hard artifacts. Sarah was there as a reporter. She had assembled an evidence packet that included the raw clip she had received, a forensic report from an independent video analyst she had commissioned pending legal access, and the email chains suggesting an attempt to manage narrative. She did not go beyond what she could document. She let the artifacts speak. Maya questioned Cooper in the formal way attorneys do when looking for gaps. Cooper's defense was procedural. He had acted on a call. He had followed the outline of his training. He insisted the camera had malfunctioned. When asked about the radio call and whether he had deliberately deactivated the camera, his answers became tight and on message, the way a seasoned officer's rehearsed script can hold. A recording of the exchange later showed Cooper's face grow pale when the badge flashed in the clip. Witness memory, even professional memory, bends under new evidence. That moment, the visible startle, had been the hinge. The oversight panel requested forensic verification. An independent analyst testified that truncation of a body-worn file is technically possible, but that server logs are the proper path to verify intent. She explained, in terms that were sober and mechanical, how metadata stamps on raw files and preservation server logs could show fragments of an editing history. The panel asked the department to produce an unedited copy. The department replied that their records custodian was preparing the archive and would deliver as soon as possible. As soon as possible became a phrase that, for many in public seats, sounded like a promise that would need enforcement. Within the hearing's 6th hour, an unanticipated witness came forward, Officer Williams, who had initially signed a bland statement describing the sequence. In a quiet moment, influenced by legal counsel and the weight of facts made public, Williams altered his account to say he had seen Cooper touch the camera housing and heard the click that signaled a stop. He told the panel that he had been encouraged to say the camera failed in an immediate debrief. That testimony widened the frame from an isolated technical glitch to an allegation of guided narrative control. Williams's words did not, by themselves, convict anyone of criminal action, but they forced the board to widen its inquiry and to request criminal subpoenas for certain records. The procedural stage had morphed into a more consequential arena. At home, after the first public hearing and the week of heated reporting, Emma drew a picture of a badge and a small house. She said nothing about the parking garage. She colored the badge gold and the house green, as if justice and the ordinary world might be held in chalk. Franklin pinned the drawing on his kitchen bulletin board, right above the calendar where he marked days by meetings and filings. The picture would be a small human index in the weeks to come, proof that any public story is ultimately about private lives. The leak that Sarah had feared, public release of raw files without chain of custody, arrived in a different form. An advocacy group posted a fuller clip that appeared to contain audio from a distant security camera in the garage. The audio was muffled but contained enough context to corroborate the sequence Sarah had documented. The group labeled their release as evidence assembled for public interest. The release intensified calls for independent prosecutors. Officials who had earlier hoped for containment now faced the reality that small fragments, even partial, could aggregate into a public narrative forcing formal action. As investigators followed server trails and email chains, more documents surfaced that suggested not only an interruption but a pattern: recommended edits, dispersed talking points, and a note that read, "Mitigate exposure." Legal counsel used cautious language, appears to indicate, but even a cautious phrasing in an institutional memo functions as a lever of accountability once made visible to citizens and oversight bodies. The Oversight Board recommended forwarding their findings to the county prosecutor for a review of potential obstruction of evidence statutes and to the state's attorney general for an independent inquiry.
The department, in response, announced an administrative suspension for Cooper pending investigation. The announcement was neither a conviction nor a full exoneration. It was a procedural outcome consistent with the evidence chain and the pressure applied by public attention. That suspension, described officially as administrative leave pending review, was a moment of partial validation for Franklin. It did not erase the indignity of that night in the garage, nor did it clear the institutional practices that allowed the interruption. But it demonstrated how documentation and public friction can open space for accountability. The City Council announced hearings to consider revisions to policies on body-worn camera retention, chain of custody requirements, and penalties. The Oversight Board recommended forwarding their findings to the county prosecutor for a review of potential obstruction of evidence statutes and to the state's attorney general for an independent inquiry. The department, in response, announced an administrative suspension for Cooper pending investigation. The announcement was neither a conviction nor a full exoneration. It was a procedural outcome consistent with the evidence chain and the pressure applied by public attention. That suspension, described officially as administrative leave pending review, was a moment of partial validation for Franklin. It did not erase the indignity of that night in the garage, nor did it clear the institutional practices that allowed the interruption. But it demonstrated how documentation and public friction can open space for accountability. The City Council announced hearings to consider revisions to policies on body-worn camera retention, chain of custody requirements, and penalties.
A preliminary report suggested mandatory cross-jurisdictional audits when federal credentials are displayed in local enforcement interactions. These were procedural changes, not immediate cures, but they were concrete. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, FOIA back and forth, and the slow accretion of records. Maya filed a civil complaint on Franklin's behalf that framed the incident as part of a pattern of discriminatory stops, supported by the documented interruption of recording and the subsequent chain of evasive practices. She couched claims in legal terms: constitutional violation for unreasonable seizure, procedural mismanagement of evidence, and an argument for injunctive relief to force policy changes. Her filings were careful, each word calibrated to court standards. Franklin sat beside her at one hearing and felt the strange intimacy of litigative process, public exposure paired with the dryness of pleadings. In depositions, officers repeated earlier lines: camera malfunction, misinterpretation, training gaps, until a technician from the cloud service testified that deletion or truncation requires user action and shows forensic signatures. An automatic malfunction would leave a different trail. The hearing record thus began to incline toward a conclusion that intentional interference had occurred. Still, the legal standard for criminality is higher than public indignation. Proving intentional obstruction beyond reasonable doubt would be an uphill climb. Attorneys, prosecutors, and watchdogs spoke publicly of preliminary findings and evidentiary gaps. That legal caution frustrated some and reassured others. The tension was itself a reminder that law proceeds by standards that protect the accused even as they complicate remedies for victims. The public hearing that would become the narrative's climax convened in a larger auditorium, its seats filled by residents, activists, and neighbors who had followed the story. The Oversight Board released a packet of redacted documents that included dispatch logs, the records custodian's notes, and a timeline of file modifications. Sarah's investigative team displayed a visual timeline on a screen: 2212 dispatch call, 2213 arrival, 2214 badge flash, 2214-11 body cam LED off, 0217 next morning re-upload, trim requested notation on the records log. The graphic had no rhetoric. It was engineered evidence. The room held its breath in the way that rooms do when facts are allowed to speak without spin. Franklin took the stand. He did not theatrically dramatize the mugging of dignity he had endured. He narrated facts and sensations. He described the hum of the fluorescents,
the weight of hands on his arms, the feel of his badge against his palm when he produced it. He described Cooper's face going white. He spoke clearly about the sequence of actions, the steps he had taken to preserve evidence, and the emotional effects on his family. He did not ask for vengeance.
He asked for truth. When he left the lectern, a woman from the community rose and said, simply, "We need our institutions to be accountable to us." That statement, small and plain, landed heavily in the hall. The board voted to accept the compiled report and to send its findings to the county prosecutor and to recommend that the city council adopt enhanced transparency measures. The vote was not a thunderclap. It was a bureaucratic forward motion. But in that movement lay the seed of policy change. Community groups celebrated the modest victory with tempered language. The proposed reforms included mandatory retention windows for raw body-worn footage, stricter controls on who could request edits and for what purposes, and an independent custodian to verify chain of custody when federal credentials are presented in local enforcement scenarios. The City Council agreed to hold a drafting committee and to fast-track public comment. These were changes that would have real effects: longer retention, mandatory audit trails, and clearer penalties for tampering. For Franklin, the outcome was mixed, as outcomes often are. Cooper remained under administrative investigation. Charges had not been filed publicly at the time of the council's vote. The union pushed back, framing every disciplinary step as a threat to officers' morale. Several officers expressed concern about the precedent set for interactions where federal and local jurisdictions touch. But the record had been made public, and the record refused to be fully rewritten. At home that night, Franklin watched Emma sleep with a tiredness that had nothing to do with the legal calendar. He thought about the badge on his kitchen bulletin board, about the way truth can be both fragile and durable. He had set out to document a wrong, not to make spectacle. What had happened had become, by attention and documents and law, a lever for change. Whether that lever would pry open deeper structural reforms remained to be seen. But for a family and for a neighborhood, the fact that the interruption of a camera had been inspected and that reforms were proposed felt like progress. The final public note from the Oversight Board urged continued vigilance. It named specific policy proposals and invited community input. Sarah's reporting continued to track the implementation of the proposed measures and to interview folks on both sides of the debate. Maya filed a motion for injunctive relief to ensure the raw files remained preserved for the duration of litigation. The City Council scheduled further hearings and an audit of records practices. Franklin kept the drawing Emma had colored pinned to his board. Sometimes, after hearings, he would glance up at the gold badge she had scribbled and feel a small human confirmation that beyond the institutional back and forth, his family had remained his compass. He could not claim victory. He could claim the persistence of facts and the slow accretion of accountability. The badge, the camera, the timestamp, all small physical things, had become actors in a civic drama. Evidence mattered. Process mattered. When the initial frenzy settled and the filings settled into long-form litigation, the community's energy did not evaporate but redirected into oversight committees and civic workshops about police accountability. The city moved to pilot an independent custodian program, and a draft ordinance included language about preserving raw footage for a minimum period and required public reporting when footage had been altered. The measures would not solve every problem. They were, however, a concrete step, policy responding to a pattern exposed through documents and public attention. On a quiet evening some months later, Franklin drove Emma past the parking garage. The fluorescent lights hummed as they always had, but the world felt slightly altered, not because one man had been vindicated, but because routine behaviors now carried new constraints. The badge at Franklin's hip felt like the same object and an altered symbol. It could no longer be hidden, nor could it be naively presumed to grant immunity from scrutiny. It could, if the institutions did what was proposed, serve as a prompt for clearer chains of accountability when federal and local worlds intersected.
Emma asked from her car seat, "Daddy, did you get home safe that night?" Franklin looked at her small face in the rearview mirror and answered simply, a father who had navigated public spectacle and private care. "Yes, we were safe. But sometimes people have to make sure others follow the rules so everyone is safer." She nodded. Her understanding was not abstract. It was grounded in the small ethical lessons she could hold. Facts matter. People in power should be asked to show them. The story that began with a flashlight blade and a badge that flashed in a parking garage had rippled into policy proposals, public hearings, and a small but durable shift in local practice. It had not been a tidy ending, few civic stories are, but it had demonstrated the connective tissue between evidence, public attention, and institutional accountability. The badge that had once been a fleeting star in a flashlight beam had become, because of documents, testimony, and civic insistence, part of a ledger that demanded response. The public outreach that followed was careful. Community forums, written policy proposals, and an independent audit promised by the City Council. Advocates pressed for more, better training, broader oversight, and clearer penalties for tampering. Officials drafted language about mandatory retention and cross-jurisdictional notification. Nothing was final, but the change in motion was visible, gentle, and real. And in a kitchen with a crayon drawing on the wall, the small moral lesson remained uncomplicated. Emma looked at the gold badge she had colored and, without civic jargon, said what many felt. Truth is important.
Franklin folded the small phrase into his continuing work, into his complaints, his motions, his testimony. It was not poetic, it was enough. The garage hummed in memory and in municipal minutes. The red LED that had stopped blinking forced a question on institutions and citizens alike. When a camera goes dark, what steps can be taken to make sure the truth is still available? The answer, in this place and in that moment, came in a chain of documents, public pressure, and the stubborn insistence of people who would not let a partial clip remain the final sentence. The badge remained, the camera stayed, and the timestamp kept its quiet, immutable accounting. What had been a 3-second fragment had become a series of actions. Complaints filed, subpoenas served, hearings held, proposals written, that together nudged a system to be less opaque. The outcome was not a moment of wholesale redemption, but a procedural realignment, a recalibration toward transparency that would, over time, make similar improvised silences harder to sustain. Franklin kept a small notebook where he wrote dates and follow-up items, the bureaucrat's survival tool. He added council meeting dates, names of attorneys, and the next steps in policy drafting. The list was plain and procedural, and, in its plainness, the most faithful record of what a single documented interaction can do. It can mark a point at which a public insists on an answer, and where institutions must produce one. He looked at Emma's crayon badge again and felt, not triumph, but the cautious satisfaction of one who had invested in process and seen process begin to work. The city had not become perfect. It had, however, begun to accept, tentatively, through motions and minutes, that evidence, when preserved and presented, matters. And for a man who had kept his hands visible on a hood until the officers accepted the badge as true, that was a form of restitution. The public record closed one chapter by entering a new one, the work of implementation. The reforms proposed would require oversight, audits, and a community willing to hold institutions to their promises. The transcript of that night in the garage, the logs, the clip fragments, the email chains, remained a touchstone. Its power was simple and mechanical. Recorded fact resists erasure better than memory does. And somewhere between the citizen who filmed a 3-second clip, the reporter who assembled the timeline, the attorney who filed the complaint, and the public body that convened to consider policy, a civic mechanism reasserted itself. It was not dramatic, it was not conclusive. It was, however, demonstrably effective in one small but important way. It converted a brief encounter into a public conversation, and that conversation began to change rules.
The narrative closed not with a final verdict, but with an instruction. When institutions are questioned with evidence and citizens insist on transparency, change, incremental, procedural, documentary, becomes possible. Franklin met with Maya and Sarah months later to review drafts of the ordinance, their conversations dense with clause language and practicalities. They laughed once, quietly, over the absurdity that legal text could feel like salvation. It did in its way. Law and policy are not the same as moral rightness, but they make possible a scaffolding where rights can be honored. Emma's drawing still sat above the calendar. Franklin traced the crayon line with a finger one night before filing into sleep. Outside, the city breathed on its slow rhythms. Inside, the small household held the evidence of both fury and forbearance. A badge, a camera that had once gone dark and now existed within a system forced by scrutiny to be more light-bearing, and a child who believed, as children do, that truth is simple and essential. A civic engine had turned, noisy as procedural wheels and quiet as a crayon hand. The badge had revealed a shocking twist, and in that revelation the city had found, at least for a moment, a path toward accountability. The work would continue. So would the watching. So would the record. The ordinance came by inches and signatures. It did not arrive as a thunderclap, but as a set of small, stubborn amendments. Clauses about timestamps, about mandatory archival procedures, about independent review when footage was questioned. There were penalties, technical standards, and a modest oversight board that included residents, not only officials. On the afternoon the council voted, the chamber smelled of coffee and paper and the low heat of many bodies leaning forward to listen. Franklin sat near the front with his notebook, its pages now soft at the edges from use. Beside him, Emma insisted on wearing the crayon badge. She had added a loop of yarn so it would not fall. Maya and Sarah waited with him, their shoulders close in the way of people who have shared long meetings and longer nights. When the mayor, who had once resisted the first complaint, signed the handwritten copy and placed it on the clerk's desk, applause was small but deliberate. Those who had watched the process knew that applause did not finish the work. It only acknowledged a moment when a community had obliged itself to try. Implementation proved its predictable patience. Technical teams met engineers. The oversight board scheduled its first audit, and the local public defender's office published guidance for preserving evidence. There were mercifully few dramatics thereafter. No sweeping removals, no vindications sudden and absolute. The officers whose actions had provoked scrutiny were subject to review. Some received reprimands, some returned to duty with retraining, and some quietly left public service.
The legal record closed around individual files, but the ordinance opened a wider corridor, a set of expectations that would outlast any one person. At home, life resumed its quieter arcs. Emma began a new grade. Her drawings multiplied, each one a small claim on the world. Franklin continued to feed the notebook, dates, deadlines, names, but he began to make other entries too. A reminder to pick up baking soda, a note about a library meeting, a scrawl that read simply, "Bring flowers for Maya's birthday." The bureaucrat's survival tool softened into a domestic ledger. He still traced the crayon line at night, but he did it with a gentler hand, as if honoring not only an event, but the ordinary continuance that follows hardship. Years taught them what a civic shift actually costs and how slowly it yields. There were nights when cameras failed again, and nights when records were ambiguous. There were advocates who tired, and new ones who took up the work. Sometimes the oversight board demanded more than officials were willing to give. Sometimes the press lost interest. Yet the city had shifted its baseline. Preservation of evidence became a default obligation rather than an afterthought. That change, incremental, procedural, often dull, made moments like the garage less likely to disappear into silence. On a late spring morning, Emma, not quite a teenager, went with Franklin to the new evidence room annex at the municipal building. They walked through a corridor lined with small plaques, an acknowledgement of grants, a list of volunteers, the names of committee chairs. Emma pointed, matter of fact, at a plaque that bore her crayon badge rendered in a neat bronze relief. In witness of what was seen. Franklin felt an old, complicated relief settle in his chest. Not triumph, but something steadier. The badge on the plaque was as much a reminder of constraint as of courage. That a city could demand to know, and that knowing required work. They left together into the sound of ordinary traffic and school bells. Emma grabbed his hand in the way she had when she was smaller, then let go to run ahead. Franklin watched her go and saw, in the small, forward steps of a child, the larger motion of community. People nudging a system, paper by paper, hearing by hearing, until the next generation could move with clearer sight. The record remained, as it had to. The watching continued. So did the slow, necessary making of a public that will not allow truth to be trimmed away. Outside the municipal building, the sun caught on the bronze crayon and on Emma's yarned badge. Both glinted, modestly, like promises kept imperfectly, but kept nonetheless.